Imagine for a second that you are completely paralyzed.
Oh boy. Starting right in the deep end.
Yeah, well, picture it. Your body temperature is spiking to a lethal 107 degrees. You are strapped to a hospital bed, but you aren't really there.
Right, you're somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. Your mind is trapped inside this terrifying, incredibly vivid hallucination. You're being tortured, systematically mutilated, kept alive just so you can suffer more.
That is just horrific.
It is. And the people standing over you with the scalpels and the knives, they aren't faceless demons. They are all the serial killers, the rapists, the child molesters, the actual butchers that you have spent your entire career putting behind bars.
Wow.
They have finally caught you. They're exacting their revenge, and you literally cannot lift a single finger to fight back.
I mean, it sounds exactly like the climax of some psychological horror film.
Right.
But that nightmare was an actual lived near-death experience. It wasn't a crime scene. That was the mind of a pioneering FBI profiler, literally buckling under the sheer crushing weight of hunting the worst monsters humanity has to offer. His brain was just collapsing from the inside out.
And that terrifying hospital room is exactly where we're going to begin today.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome to the deep dive. We are taking you into the absolute darkest, most claustrophobic corners of the human psyche.
We really are.
We've got this incredible stack of notes, excerpts, and declassified case files drawn from the landmark book, Mindhunter.
Yeah, and our mission today is to really pull back the curtain on this terrifying era in law enforcement. We're going to examine the exact tipping point when the FBI realized that traditional, by-the-book police work was completely useless against a new, highly evolved breed of killer.
This just wasn't working anymore.
Not at all. The Bureau realized the only way to catch a serial killer was to do the unthinkable, which was to walk into maximum security prisons, sit down face-to-face with the most dangerous predators alive, and let them teach the FBI how to hunt.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. And we are going to explore how those prison interviews built a psychological toolkit that ultimately cracked some of the most infamous, seemingly unsolvable cases in modern history.
Okay, let's unpack this setup because we really need to understand the physical and emotional toll of this work before the breakthroughs make any sense.
Absolutely.
That hallucination I described at the top, that happened in December 1983 at Swedish Hospital in Seattle.
Right.
The investigator had just collapsed on the floor of his hotel room. He was in a coma, suffering from viral encephalitis. The fever was so high, so catastrophic, that the right side of his brain had literally ruptured.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. The doctors actually pulled his colleagues aside and told them his brain had been, and this is a direct quote from the medical staff, they said it was fried to a crisp.
When you look at the physiological mechanics of what happened to him, it wasn't just like a random exposure to a bug. His immune system was essentially obliterated by chronic, unrelenting stress.
Because of the workload, right.
Exactly. At the moment he collapsed, this single investigator was carrying roughly 150 active cases.
Wait, 150 active homicides?
Yes.
I mean, I'm trying to just visualize the sheer volume of paperwork alone, let alone the psychological burden. How does one human being process 150 different active murder investigations all at the same time?
They don't process it. They just survive it until they don't. And these were not simple localized crimes either. Look at his itinerary from the notes.
Yeah, I saw that. He was all over the map.
He was actively consulting on the Trailside Killer in San Francisco, where a predator was hunting hikers. He was advising Scotland Yard on the Yorkshire Ripper case over in England.
Wow, internationally, too.
Yeah. He was working the Robert Hansen disappearances up in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, and he was boots on the ground for the Green River Killer in Seattle. He was basically the only person in the FBI's behavioral science unit who was working these active field cases full-time.
Traveling, what, like 125 days a year?
At least. Everywhere he went, he was absorbing the unimaginable grief of the victims' families while simultaneously bearing the pressure of local police chiefs who were staring at cold trails and demanding answers right then and there.
And the most maddening part of all this is that profiling wasn't even a fully respected discipline at the FBI back then. It was treated like a parlor trick.
Oh, absolutely. Like voodoo.
I was reading through the roots of profiling in the source material, and it essentially started in fiction. You have Edgar Allan Poe's detective C. Auguste Dupin back in the 1840s, or Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes looking at, a scuff mark on a shoe and deducing a man's entire life story.
Right, the classic armchair detective.
Exactly. Law enforcement didn't take any of that seriously until the 1950s in New York City with the Mad Bomber case.
The Mad Bomber is really the perfect genesis point for real-life profiling. For over a decade, this guy was terrorizing New York, leaving explosives in theaters and train stations. The police literally had nothing.
No leads at all.
None. So they finally brought in a psychiatrist named Dr. James A. Brussel. He looked at the crime scene photos. He analyzed the terrifyingly precise letters the bomber sent to the newspapers, and he produced a profile.
And Dr. Brussel predicted the bomber would be a middle-aged, foreign-born Roman Catholic living with maiden sisters in Connecticut, which is already incredibly specific.
Highly specific.
But then he added this unbelievably wild detail. He said that when the police finally caught the guy, he would be wearing a double-breasted suit and it would be perfectly buttoned.
Yeah.
I read that and immediately thought, okay, that's just a lucky guess. That sounds like complete pseudoscience.
I know it sounds like a magic trick, but look at the deductive logic Brussel used. It wasn't a guess at all. Brussel noticed the letters the bomber sent were incredibly neat, with perfectly symmetrical margins and no block lettering. So he deduced that a man who demands perfect rigid symmetry in his handwriting also demands perfect rigid symmetry in his daily life. A double-breasted suit was the most symmetrical, buttoned-up, conservative piece of clothing a man could wear in the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the paranoia evident in the bomber's grievances suggested this obsessive traditionalist personality. When the police finally arrested George Metesky, he asked to change his clothes. When he walked out of his bedroom to be handcuffed, he was wearing a perfectly buttoned, double-breasted suit.
That is just, I mean, it gives you chills. That transition from analyzing physical evidence to analyzing the psychological blueprint behind the evidence is crucial because the traditional methods were suddenly failing hard.
They really were.
The text highlights this terrifying shift in the statistics. Back in the 1960s, the homicide solution rate in the United States was over 90%. Almost every murder was solved.
And the fundamental reason for that 90% clearance rate was proximity. In the 1960s, victims almost always knew their killers. The motives were the classic, ancient human flaws. Anger, financial greed, jealousy, a lover's revenge. If a woman was murdered in her home, the police looked at the husband, the ex-boyfriend, or maybe a business partner.
It was a straight line.
Exactly. Traditional police work, the standard interrogation approach worked perfectly because the detectives just had to follow the visible threads of the relationship.
But then the 1970s hit and those threads just vanish. Law enforcement starts seeing this explosion of the stranger killer.
Yes.
This is the serial offender who specifically targets people they have never met. They learn from each crime, they adapt, and they perfect their hunting scenarios. If a killer doesn't know the victim, doesn't take their wallet, and doesn't have a visible, tangible reason to hate them, the traditional homicide detective just hits a brick wall.
And bleed dead end.
The murder appears entirely motiveless.
What's fascinating here is that the traditional detective hits a wall because they are looking for logic where none exists. The motives for these stranger killings were purely internal, driven by psychological fantasies rather than external conflicts. And the FBI establishment was notoriously slow to adapt to this.
They weren't just slow, they were actively hostile to the behavioral science unit.
Very true.
The investigator notes that he was officially censured by the Bureau for a comment he made to the press during the Atlanta child murders case, even though that very same profile was later used to catch the killer and actually earn him a commendation.
Yeah, the irony is thick.
The institutional attitude seemed to be, we won't support you, but you have to work yourself into the grave to prove this science works.
That institutional friction just compounded the physical stress. He was pioneering a field that veteran, old-school cops viewed as complete nonsense. He was dealing in psychological opinions, not fingerprint matches or ballistics.
Right.
So he lived with the constant paralyzing awareness that if his profile was wrong, he could steer an entire task force in the wrong direction, wasting precious time while the killer selected another victim.
Which brings me to this really powerful analogy in the notes. The investigator compares the entire process to watching a nature documentary. He talks about the lion and the antelope.
I love that analogy.
It's so vivid. If you watch a lion looking at a massive herd of antelope, the lion doesn't just run blindly into the middle of the herd hoping to catch something.
No, it's calculated.
Right. The lion sits in the tall grass and watches. It locks onto a single antelope. It has trained itself over a lifetime to sense weakness, an uneven gait, a momentary distraction, something fundamentally vulnerable about that one specific animal that makes it the easiest prey.
It is a brutal but vital framework for understanding predatory behavior on city streets. The serial offender does the exact same thing in a busy shopping mall, on a college campus, or at a dimly lit bus stop. They're constantly profiling the public, looking for the human equivalent of the limp.
So, sitting with that analogy, here's my fundamental problem with this whole endeavor.
Okay, what is it?
If we acknowledge that these killers hunt with the detached, cold-blooded instincts of apex predators, how do you train a normal human being, like a guy with a family and a mortgage, to think exactly like the lion, without that darkness permanently infecting their own humanity?
That is the central paradox of the behavioral science unit. To catch the monster, you have to invite the monster's logic into your own mind.
Which is terrifying.
It really is. You have to intellectually experience their thrill of the hunt to anticipate their next moves. And the early profilers realized they couldn't learn that from textbooks. The only way to understand the lion was to step directly into the lion's den.
And that pivot leads us into what is arguably the most fascinating and terrifying section of this deep dive, the maximum security prison interviews.
Yeah, in the late 1970s, these agents decided to hit the road. They started going into the deepest, darkest wings of federal and state penitentiaries to interview incarcerated serial killers. Keep in mind, this was entirely unprecedented.
Right, nobody was doing this.
Usually, once a killer was locked up, society just threw away the key and tried to forget them.
And sometimes the profilers went in meticulously prepared, having memorized every crime scene photo, every autopsy report, every court transcript. But occasionally, to protect the confidentiality of the program from the prison population, they went in completely cold, with zero background on the inmate sitting across from them.
And those cold interviews provided the ultimate testing ground for behavioral deduction. Take the interview with Charlie Davis in the Maryland State Penitentiary.
Okay.
The profiler walks in. Davis is this massive, imposing guy. The profiler has absolutely no idea what crimes put Davis in that room. And Davis, trying to establish dominance, just casually leans back and says, "I killed 5 people."
Instead of reacting with shock, the profiler just starts asking mechanical questions. Davis explains that he worked as a part-time ambulance driver. He would pick up women, strangle them, dump their bodies on the side of the highway, make an anonymous call to the police from a payphone, and then in this incredibly twisted power move, he would be the one to respond to the dispatch call in his ambulance.
That is just a guess.
Right. He would drive back to the scene to pick up the very body he had just dumped.
Notice the underlying psychology there. Why go back? By responding to the scene as the medical professional, Davis inserts himself into the center of the investigation. He is standing shoulder to shoulder with the detectives and paramedics, playing the role of the helper, all while holding the godlike secret that he is the architect of the tragedy.
It's sick.
It provided him with an intoxicating surge of absolute control and orchestration.
But the interview gets even stranger. Davis starts describing his 5th and final murder. He mentions almost offhandedly that after he strangled her, he covered her head up in the front seat of his car. He hadn't done that with the previous 4 victims. I'm reading the transcript of this interview, and the profiler immediately halts the conversation. He points at Davis and says, "You didn't feel good about this one. She told you something that made you feel bad, but you killed her anyway."
And Davis is visibly shaken by that.
He admits that before he killed her, the woman pleaded for her life by explaining that her husband was desperately sick, possibly dying, and she was terrified of leaving her child alone. Davis hadn't worn a disguise, so he felt he had passed the point of no return. He had to kill her to protect his identity.
That is deductive profiling in real time. Covering the victim's face is a classic behavioral marker. It signifies a killer trying to depersonalize a victim they suddenly feel an unwanted emotional connection to.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if you cover the eyes, you don't have to look at the humanity you're extinguishing.
But the profiler pushes it one step further, and this is the part that sounds like literal mind reading.
Here we go.
The profiler looks at Davis and says, "You took something from her wallet, didn't you? And you went to her gravesite, and you left that item on her grave." And Davis just physically collapses. He hangs his head.
It's incredible.
It turns out he had stolen a family photograph of the woman, her sick husband, and her child from her purse, and days later he had driven to her grave to leave it there. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking that sounds like psychic intuition, you aren't alone. How does a profiler logically deduce a stolen photograph at a grave?
It's all about resolving cognitive dissonance. The profiler knows from behavioral science that killers occasionally revisit grave sites. It isn't always to gloat or revel in the victory. Sometimes, particularly when a connection was formed, the killer experiences a warped, fractured sense of remorse.
So the photo was an apology.
Essentially, yes. Davis felt guilty about destroying that specific family unit. The photograph was the physical manifestation of that family. By returning the photo to the grave, Davis was subconsciously trying to undo the damage to return the family to her. The profiler simply strung those behavioral cues, the covered face, the expressed remorse, the logic of souvenirs, into a cohesive narrative.
It's breathtaking to see the human mind decoded like that, and then the profilers move on to the heavy hitters, the names that everyone knows, guys like Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer.
Kemper is a terrifyingly pure case study in psychopathy. Physically, he is imposing. 6'9", nearly 300 pounds. Mentally, he is highly articulate, possessing a genius-level IQ.
Yeah.
He targeted intelligent young college students in California. Ultimately, his rampage culminated in the murder of his own mother and her friend. He decapitated his mother and buried her head face up in his backyard.
God.
When asked why, he calmly explained that it was so she would finally have to, quote, look up to him.
The psychological degradation of that act is just staggering. But what I found most chilling in the Kemper notes wasn't the violence, it was the pristine mechanical logic he used to hunt.
Right.
He sat down with the FBI and explained exactly how he overcame his victim's survival instincts. He revealed what he called his watch-glance trick. He said that when he was driving around and spotted a college girl hitchhiking, he would pull his car over, and right as she approached the passenger window, he would visibly check his watch.
Let's break down the visual signaling of that action. A young woman is approaching a strange car. She sees a gargantuan 6'9" man behind the wheel. Every evolutionary survival instinct in her brain is screaming at her to run.
Exactly, she's frantic.
She's frantically assessing the threat level.
But then he looks at his watch, and in an instant, that gesture flips the entire script. A man checking his watch implies he is on a strict schedule. He has a job, he has responsibilities, he has a destination. A predator doesn't care about the time. A busy commuter cares about the time.
It's brilliant in the darkest way possible.
By glancing at his wrist, Kemper signals that stopping for her is actually a minor annoyance. It completely disarms her because it shifts the social pressure. Suddenly, she feels like she is inconveniencing him. She gets in the car to avoid being rude. It is a masterpiece of dark psychology.
And that manipulation requires a profound understanding of human empathy, even if the killer lacks empathy himself. They understand how normal people react to social cues.
What unsettled me deeply while reading these interview transcripts is the investigator's own reaction to Kemper. The profiler notes that Kemper was incredibly likable. He was a great conversationalist. The FBI agents actually found themselves enjoying his company, laughing at his jokes.
Which is a very tough thing to admit.
If you step back from that, it is horrifying. You are sharing a laugh with a man who butchered college students. How do you maintain your moral compass when the monster is that charming?
It demands an extreme level of mental compartmentalization.
No.
You have to separate the conversationalist sitting in front of you from the forensic realities of the autopsy photos in your briefcase. But the charm is exactly what the profilers were there to study.
Right.
That charm is the camouflage. If serial killers all looked and acted like rabid dogs, they would be caught immediately.
And sitting with Kemper allowed the FBI to solidify the core motivations behind these seemingly motiveless crimes. They realized that the crimes weren't actually about the physical act of killing. The three primary motives of violent serial offenders boil down to manipulation, domination, and control.
Even in crimes that appear overtly sexual, the sex is often just a secondary vehicle for the ultimate goal of domination. Take Kemper's post-mortem mutilations. The victims were already deceased. They couldn't feel pain or register fear.
So it wasn't torture.
Exactly. Therefore, the mutilation wasn't about inflicting sadistic punishment. It was a fetishistic fantasy of ultimate possession. Kemper felt socially inadequate and powerless with living, breathing women who could reject him. So he killed them in order to completely own them, turning them into inanimate objects that he possessed absolute control over.
Once the profilers understood that control was the currency these killers dealt in, they changed their interview tactics. They realized that interrogating these guys wasn't about beating a confession out of them, it was a psychological seduction.
Yes.
With a guy like Kemper, who brags himself on his genius IQ, you play it straight. You act like a student. You let him lecture you, let him show off how brilliant he is, and in his arrogance, he hands you the behavioral data. But you contrast that with their interview with Richard Speck.
Richard Speck is a completely different psychological profile.
Yeah.
In 1966, he broke into a Chicago townhouse and systematically murdered 8 student nurses in a single night.
Just brutal.
When the profiler sat down with Speck in prison, he was belligerent. He immediately threw up a defensive wall, pointing at the other inmates and claiming, "I'm not a serial killer. Those guys are crazy."
The mental gymnastics required to kill 8 women in one evening and then claim you aren't one of the crazy ones is astounding.
But that defensive posture gives the profiler the key to the lock. Speck isn't an organized analytical thinker like Kemper. He is disorganized, reactive, and driven by explosive anger rather than calculated manipulation.
So they changed tactics.
Absolutely. The agents completely drop the respectful student routine. You do not validate Richard Speck. You use a hostile, confrontational approach to break down his fragile ego. You find out what triggers his aggression. You push those buttons, and you force him to react emotionally, which bypasses his lies.
The data they mined from these different approaches led to massive operational breakthroughs. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam who terrorized New York City, provided one of the most critical insights in the history of the program.
He really did.
Berkowitz wasn't taking physical souvenirs. He wasn't taking jewelry or clothing from the cars where he shot his victims. Instead, he confessed to the profilers that days after a shooting, he would sneak back to the actual crime scene. He would roll around in the dirt where the victims had bled, masturbating, and mentally reliving the murder.
That revelation fundamentally changed how the FBI investigated active scenes. Prior to Berkowitz, police recognized that killers sometimes returned to the scene, but they usually assumed it was out of paranoia, like a desire to see if the priest had found a dropped weapon or to monitor the investigation.
Right.
Berkowitz proved that they returned to refuel.
Right, because the fantasy fades, the thrill of the kill diminishes, and they need to recharge that battery by physically touching the environment where they exerted ultimate control.
Exactly. And once law enforcement understands why the predator returns, they can transition from reactive policing to proactive hunting. You don't just process a crime scene and leave. You stake it out. You monitor the gravesite. You set a trap, knowing the killer's psychological addiction will likely force them to return.
But having this knowledge locked up in the basement of the FBI Academy at Quantico doesn't help the beat cop in Ohio or the homicide detective in Seattle. The behavioral science unit realized they needed to synthesize thousands of hours of terrifying prison conversations into a clean, practical toolkit. They needed a language that local police could actually use in the field.
And the foundation of that toolkit was a concept that completely changed the trajectory of criminal investigations. They drew a hard, permanent line between a killer's modus operandi, the MO, and their signature.
Let's spend some time here, because if you watch any television police procedural, you hear the term MO thrown around constantly. But we almost never hear about signature, and understanding the difference is the entire key to behavioral profiling.
Modus operandi is simply the functional method the killer uses to commit the crime and evade capture. How do they gain entry? What weapon do they bring? Do they use duct tape or rope to bind the victim? The most important thing to understand about MO is that it is dynamic. It is a learned behavior that evolves over time.
Because the killer gets smarter.
Precisely. A killer might start out using a knife, realize that close quarters combat is too messy and risky, and switch to a firearm for the next attack. They might initially break a window to get into a house, but later learn how to quietly pick a lock.
Okay.
If a local police department is strictly analyzing the MO, they might look at a stabbing with a broken window and a shooting with a picked lock and conclude they're hunting two completely different suspects.
This is where signature changes the game. While the MO is dynamic and evolves, the signature is completely static.
The signature is the unique, deeply ingrained emotional compulsion that the killer must fulfill to satisfy their internal fantasy. It has absolutely nothing to do with getting away with the crime. In fact, fulfilling the signature often takes extra time and increases their risk of getting caught.
Give me an example of what a signature looks like in practice.
It could be the highly specific way a body is posed after death to degrade the victim. It could be a specific type of ritualistic mutilation or leaving a very specific object at the scene. The killer might change their weapon from a knife to a gun, changing the MO. But if they always pose the victim's arms crossed over their chest with their shoes removed, that is their signature.
Ah, I see.
The functional method changed, but the psychological need remained static.
The analogy I keep returning to when trying to wrap my head around this is the art world. If you really want to understand the artist, you have to look past the canvas. If I'm an art critic analyzing a crime scene, I am looking for the brushstrokes.
That's a great way to think about it.
Let's take Picasso. If Picasso spends 10 years painting portraits of faces and then suddenly decides to paint a bowl of fruit, his subject matter has changed. The medium might change from oil to watercolor. That is his MO changing. But when I look closely at the fruit, I am still going to see the harsh, fragmented geometric lines of cubism. I'm going to recognize his distinct style. The cubism is his signature. You can change the subject, but you can't change the artist's soul.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. And when the FBI brought this framework out of the basement and into the courtrooms, it was devastating to defense attorneys. Consider the 1991 trial of George Russell Jr. in Seattle. He was accused of bludgeoning and strangling 3 different women.
The defense attorney tried to sever the cases. They walked into court and argued that because the women were killed in slightly different ways and the MOs varied, the prosecution couldn't prove the same man committed all 3 murders. They wanted 3 separate trials, hoping to divide and conquer the evidence.
Prior to profiling, the defense probably would have won that motion. But the FBI profilers were brought in to testify as expert witnesses. They walked the jury through the crime scenes and proved that while the MO varied, there were elements that were identical across all 3 scenes.
The brushstrokes.
Exactly. The specific blitz-style sudden attack and the highly specific, bizarre posing of the bodies at the dump sites served no functional purpose. The profilers explained that these actions constituted an undeniable behavioral signature.
Wow.
It linked the crimes psychologically, proving that the exact same twisted engine was driving all 3 murders. The judge allowed the cases to be tried together, and Russell was convicted.
There was another case in Delaware that illustrates this perfectly. Stephen Pennell, known as the Route 40 killer, his MO was all over the map. He whipped one victim, he beat another with a hammer, he cut another.
Right.
The local police must have been terrified, thinking they had 3 different maniacs operating on the same highway. But the profilers looked at the autopsy reports and realized the signature was the emotional pleasure the killer derived from the protracted act of torture. The physical tool he used to inflict pain changed, but the psychological need to extract pain slowly remained static.
Alongside establishing MO versus signature, the toolkit also formalized warning signs, most notably the homicidal triad. By studying the childhoods of men like Kemper and Berkowitz, the profilers identified 3 behavioral markers that, when present together in childhood, strongly correlate with violent psychopathy in adulthood.
What are they?
The triad consists of enuresis, which is bedwetting beyond an appropriate developmental age, chronic fire starting, and cruelty to animals.
The enuresis is often linked to underlying trauma or neurological issues, but the fire starting and the animal cruelty, that seems like the psychological training ground.
It is the escalation of control. A child who feels powerless in their environment discovers that by starting a fire, they can command the attention of adults and destroy property. They wield power.
And the animals.
Torturing animals is the next step. They practice domination and destruction on a living creature that is smaller and weaker than them, a creature that cannot fight back or report them to the police. Eventually, as they grow older and physically stronger, the fantasy evolves. Destroying an animal no longer satisfies the urge. The fantasy demands a human subject.
Armed with these new concepts, understanding the escalation of the triad, differentiating organized from disorganized killers, decoding MO versus signature, the behavioral science unit was finally ready to step out into active, terrifying manhunts. And looking at the case files, there is no investigation more famous or more politically and emotionally fraught than the Atlanta child murders.
To understand the Atlanta case, you have to understand the atmosphere of the city in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Atlanta was gripped by absolute paralyzing terror. Dozens of young black children and adolescents were vanishing off the streets and turning up dead in the woods and rivers.
The pressure on the local police, the mayor, and the federal government was unimaginable. And the prevailing theory, which was heavily amplified by the media and believed by a large portion of the public, was that the Ku Klux Klan or a similar white supremacist hate group was orchestrating the murders.
That was the dominant narrative.
Now, we need to be clear that we're just discussing the notes and the files here impartially, but the theory was that these hate groups were driving into black neighborhoods, snatching these kids, and murdering them in an attempt to spark a race war.
It was a highly combustible political environment. But when the FBI profilers arrived in Atlanta, set up their war room, and started reviewing the voluminous case files, they almost immediately dispelled the KKK theory.
Let's walk through the inductive logic there. Because on the surface, given the racial history of the South and the specific targeting of black victims, the KKK theory seems incredibly logical to a lot of people at the time. Why did the profilers dismiss it so quickly?
They dismissed it based on victimology and the mechanics of the hunting grounds. The profilers looked at the specific, tight-knit, predominantly black neighborhoods where these children were being abducted. If a truck full of white hate group members drove into those neighborhoods slowly cruising the streets looking for a target, they would have stuck out like a sore thumb.
People would have definitely noticed them.
Exactly. Furthermore, children are naturally wary of strangers, particularly individuals who look visibly out of place.
A white supremacist couldn't just walk up to a young black boy in that neighborhood and lure him into a car without causing a scene. The killer had to be someone who could blend into background radiation of the neighborhood seamlessly.
That's right. The profilers deduced that the killer had to be a chameleon. It had to be someone the children perceived as safe, perhaps an authority figure or someone who looked like an older brother. Based on this, the FBI produced a profile that shocked the local authorities and the public. They stated unequivocally that the killer was a black male, likely a local resident, and probably in his late 20s.
And when you look at the man they eventually caught, Wayne Williams, he fit that behavioral profile with terrifying accuracy. He was a young black man, a local operating as a freelance photographer and music promoter, which gave him the perfect excuse to approach young kids on the street.
But catching Wayne Williams was only half the battle. The physical evidence linking him to the murders was highly complex and largely circumstantial. The prosecution relied heavily on forensic fiber evidence specifically, matching unusual trilobal carpet fibers from Williams's home and car, as well as dog hair from his German Shepherd, to fibers found on the victims' bodies.
Let's be honest about fiber evidence. To a forensic scientist, matching a trilobal fiber under an electron microscope is a smoking gun. But to a jury of regular citizens sitting in a stuffy courtroom, it is incredibly boring.
Very tedious.
You have experts testifying for hours about the twist of a thread and the dye batch of a carpet. The prosecution could literally see the jury falling asleep. They realized that if the trial remained a battle of microscopic fibers, Williams might walk free. Out of desperation, they turned to the FBI profilers and asked for psychological strategy to use during the cross-examination.
This was a watershed moment where behavioral profiling merged with tactical courtroom prosecution. The profilers had analyzed Williams's personality. He was rigid, highly intelligent, deeply narcissistic, and obsessively controlling. He had maintained a polite, calm, almost arrogant demeanor throughout the trial.
Right.
The profilers designed a specific strategy to break that facade on the witness stand. They called it the "this is your life" teardown.
The mechanics of this teardown are brilliant. They instructed the prosecutor to keep Williams on the stand for hours, days if necessary, but they weren't supposed to ask him about the murders. They told the prosecutor to badger him with mundane, trivial details about his life.
Yeah, totally unrelated stuff.
Where he went to elementary school, what he ate for breakfast, the layout of his photography studio. They just kept grinding him down, forcing his brain to constantly process and control the narrative of these tiny details, building this invisible, exhausting tension.
It was a war of attrition. The profilers knew that an obsessive-compulsive narcissist needs to feel superior and needs to be in control of the room. By keeping him on the stand, answering trivial questions, they were draining his mental reserves. And then the profilers instructed the prosecutor to initiate the physical invasion.
I want to break down exactly what this means, because the profilers were essentially instructing the prosecutor to weaponize the exact same psychological manipulation that predators use on their victims. They told the prosecutor to physically leave the podium, walk across the courtroom, and invade Wayne Williams's personal space, step right up into his physical bubble.
A narcissist's physical space is their kingdom. When the prosecutor violated that boundary, it stripped away Williams's physical control. He was cornered in the witness box, and then came the psychological trigger.
It is one of the most dramatic, cinematic courtroom moments I've ever read. The prosecutor leans in, violating Williams' space, looks him dead in the eye, and whispers, "Did you panic, Wayne, when you killed these kids?"
The word choice is everything there.
Look at the specific word choice. Panic! To a control freak who prides himself on being the smartest man in the room, accusing him of panicking is the ultimate insult. It implies weakness, incompetence, and loss of control, and Williams just snapped.
He completely lost his composure. The calm, polite photographer vanished. He began arguing aggressively. His facade crumbled entirely, and for the first time in the trial, the jury saw the seething, uncontrollable rage vibrating underneath the polite exterior. They saw the monster the FBI had profiled.
I have to play devil's advocate here and push back on this strategy. If we acknowledge that profiling is ultimately an educated deduction based on behavioral patterns, wasn't it a massive, potentially catastrophic risk to base the climax of the trial on pushing a defendant's emotional buttons?
Oh, absolutely.
What if the profile was slightly off? What if Williams hadn't snapped in anger, but instead just looked at the jury, broke down, and cried like a victim being bullied by the state? The prosecution could have lost the jury's sympathy and the entire case right there.
You are entirely correct. It was an enormous high-stakes gamble, but it was a calculated gamble. The profilers didn't just guess. They had observed Williams's behavior in the courtroom for weeks. They watched how he interacted with his own defense team, how he reacted to the judge. They were confident in the narcissistic diagnosis.
So they knew he wouldn't cry.
They knew that a man with that specific psychological makeup would view crying as a weakness. Anger was the only emotional outlet his ego would allow.
It's a brilliant application of psychology in a legal setting. But while the Atlanta case showed how profiling could break a suspect in front of a jury, a case operating at the exact same time up in the frozen wilderness of Alaska proved that behavioral science could be used to catch a monster before the trial even began.
We are shifting to the terrifying case of Robert Hansen. In the early 1980s, Anchorage, Alaska was a booming oil town. It had a transient population, a lot of money, and an atmosphere almost like the Wild West. And within this environment, a deeply disturbing pattern began to emerge. Women who worked on the fringes of society, prostitutes and topless dancers, like a young woman named Sherry Morrow, were vanishing without a trace.
Because of their transient lifestyles, the police often didn't know they were missing until months later. When their bodies were finally discovered, they were found deep in the remote Alaskan woods, completely naked and shot with a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14, which is a highly specific, high-powered hunting rifle.
The local authorities eventually honed in on Robert Hansen as a suspect. On paper, Hansen seemed harmless. He was a local baker who made bread for the town. He was a married man with children. He had a severe stutter, which made him seem timid and socially awkward.
But he also had a plane, right?
Yes, he was an experienced aviator who owned a small private plane. But when the police questioned him about the disappearances, he had rock-solid alibis provided by his friends.
So the local police hit a dead end. They have a gut feeling about the baker, but zero evidence. They reach out to the FBI, and the behavioral science unit provides a profile. And the profile lays out exactly how this predator is operating. The FBI notes that the killer is specifically targeting vulnerable women victims whose disappearances won't generate immediate headlines.
Right.
He is luring them, loading them into his private plane, flying them out to areas of the wilderness accessible only by air, stripping them of their clothing, and then literally hunting them down through the snow like wild game.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the predator fantasy. And based on this highly detailed behavioral profile, the investigators did something that had never been done before. For the first time in American legal history, a judge granted a search warrant based primarily on a psychological profile. The FBI used behavioral science to establish probable cause to search Hansen's home and property.
And the execution of that search warrant revealed a house of horrors. They found the murder weapon, the Ruger Mini 14, hidden away. They found a flight map used for aviation, but it had tiny, meticulous marks on it corresponding exactly to where the victim's grave sites were located. And then they found his trophy room.
The concept of the trophy room is absolutely vital to understanding the psychology of the serial offender. Hansen's trophy room was initially what you would expect from an Alaskan hunter. It was full of mounted animal heads, bear skins, and sheep horns.
Yeah.
But hidden away in the attic insulation above the animal heads, the police found a stash of cheap jewelry, driver's licenses, and ID cards belonging to the murdered women.
I was analyzing the inventory of the items found in the attic, and I hit a logical wall. Hansen is meticulous. He is flying planes, operating firearms, managing alibis. But then the police find a stash of cheap Timex watches and plastic ID cards. If you are going to rob a victim, you take cash or you take expensive jewelry that you can melt down or pawn. Taking a victim's driver's license is literally keeping the murder weapon, metaphorically speaking.
That's right.
It is a physical anchor tying you directly to the disappearance. That level of extreme risk tells me this theft has absolutely nothing to do with financial gain.
You're hitting on the core mechanism of a psychological trophy. It is entirely emotional. Just like David Berkowitz returning to the physical dirt of his crime scenes to relive the thrill, Hansen couldn't always fly back to the grave sites. The Alaskan winters made that impossible.
So he brought the gravesite to him.
He needed a physical anchor to bring the fantasy into his daily life. Holding that cheap watch, looking at that ID card, allowed him to possess the victim long after they were dead. The object contains the memory of the hunt, allowing him to recharge his fantasy without leaving his house.
There is a really dark, chilling progression illustrated by his house. You walk into the living room, and he has hunted animals and mounted their heads on the wall to prove his dominance over nature. You walk up to the attic, and he has hunted human beings and kept their jewelry to prove his dominance over society. It is the ultimate textbook escalation of violence.
It really is.
But looking at the Robert Hansen case brings up a terrifying question. How does a man with a severe stutter, who bakes bread and pastries for his neighbors and goes home to a wife and kids, maintain this horrific dual life? How does he hide the monster from everyone around him?
It demonstrates the incredible evolutionary camouflage of the psychopathic offender. Hansen's severe stutter, his mundane job as a baker, his seemingly pathetic and non-threatening demeanor, it all worked to make him invisible. Women didn't feel threatened by the stuttering baker. They felt sorry for him.
Wow.
He weaponized their empathy. They didn't realize they were dealing with an apex predator until they were miles above the wilderness in a small plane, and by then it was too late.
Which brings us to the ultimate danger discussed in these files. If a stuttering baker can successfully camouflage himself and fool the police, his wife, and his community, how easily do these men fool the medical experts who are explicitly trained to understand the human mind?
This leads us into what is arguably the most controversial, frustrating, and devastating aspect of the criminal justice system explored in the text: the battle of the shrinks, and the tragic consequences when the psychiatric system fundamentally fails to recognize evil.
Let's talk about the Arthur Shawcross case. Up in Rochester, New York, the police were dealing with a series of brutal, horrific mutilation murders of prostitutes. The FBI profiler, Greg McCrary, reviewed the scenes. He drew up a comprehensive profile and predicted that the killer would be a man in his late 20s or early 30s.
Right.
But when they finally caught Arthur Shawcross, he was 45 years old. The profile was incredibly accurate on almost every behavioral metric, but it missed the age by 15 years. Why the massive gap?
It is a fascinating anomaly that actually ends up proving the rule of profiling. According to the developmental timeline of serial offenders, Shawcross should have been committing these specific crimes in his late 20s. The reason he wasn't is because he had been on hold. He had spent 15 years in prison for murdering 2 children. When he was finally paroled, his psychological development hadn't matured. He simply walked out of the prison gates and picked up exactly where his violent fantasy had paused a decade and a half earlier.
Let me stop you right there. He paroled a double child murderer. A man kills 2 children, serves 15 years, and the parole board just unlocks the door and lets him walk back into society. How does the psychiatric evaluation process allow that to happen?
It happens because of a terrifying systemic vulnerability in how convicts are evaluated. The system relies on young, often idealistic mental health professionals who enter the prison system wanting to heal people. They want to find the good in their patients, and their primary tool is self-reporting. They sit in a room with a killer and ask them, "How do you feel today? Do you understand the severity of your crimes? Do you feel remorse?"
I see the trap immediately. These young therapists assume they are conducting an evaluation. What they don't realize is that while they're assessing the convict is actually an expert at assessing them.
Precisely. The sociopath observes the therapist. They figure out exactly what therapeutic buzzwords the doctor wants to hear. They feign remorse. They talk about their childhood trauma. They mimic empathy.
Unbelievable.
The text notes a sickening reality. Ed Kemper, the man who decapitated his mother, and another killer named Monty Russell both managed to convince their prison psychiatrists that they were making excellent progress and were safe to be around. They received glowing progress reports from the doctors while they were actively out committing new murders on weekend furloughs or shortly after release.
It is a sick, tragic joke. You have monsters spoon-feeding psychiatric jargon to the doctors to secure their freedom. And this brings up a vital distinction the text makes, one that we often get wrong in pop culture. We throw the words psychotic and sociopathic around interchangeably like they mean the same thing. But when it comes to predicting dangerousness, what is the actual clinical difference?
It is the difference between chaos and calculation. A true psychotic has suffered a total break from reality. The text gives the harrowing example of Richard Trenton Chase, the vampire of Sacramento.
Oh, that case is wild.
Chase literally drank animal and human blood because he suffered from a severe somatic delusion. He hallucinated that his own blood was turning to powder and he needed to replenish it to survive. Psychotics are driven by delusions. They are highly disorganized. They leave chaotic, messy crime scenes, and because of that chaos, they're usually caught very quickly.
And a psychopath.
Psychopath or sociopath is completely different. They have not lost touch with reality. They know exactly what day it is, they know the speed limit, and they know that murder is illegal and immoral. They simply lack the neurological capacity to care. They are organized, deeply manipulative, and they view other human beings merely as objects to be used for their own gratification.
That chilling clarity is perfectly illustrated by Arthur Shawcross. When the Rochester police finally caught him and sat him down in the interrogation room, they asked him why he killed all those women. He didn't blame hearing voices, he didn't blame demons or aliens or a bad childhood. He looked at the detectives and calmly replied, "Taking care of business."
Yeah, that says it all.
He knew exactly what he was doing. It was a job to him.
Which brings me to a deeply unsettling question regarding the justice system. If the psychological consensus is that the only reliable predictor of future violence is a past history of violence, is our parole system fundamentally broken when it comes to dealing with these psychopathic offenders? How do you possibly determine dangerousness when the subject is a master of deception?
That is the multi-million-dollar question that the behavioral science unit forced the legal system to confront. How do you assess the true threat level of a human being who can flawlessly fake a tear? The profilers argue that the psychiatric community must stop relying on self-reporting. You cannot listen to what the killer says. You have to look at the tangible behavior, the static signature of their past crimes, and the extreme escalation required to fulfill their fantasies in order to understand what they're inevitably going to do in the future. Words lie, but behavior never lies. Which brings us to the end of this incredible, exhausting journey into the archives of Mindhunter.
We started in a hospital room in Seattle, watching an FBI agent nearly die from the toxic stress of carrying the weight of 150 monsters in his head. We followed him behind the walls of the maximum security prisons, learning the dark, manipulative secrets of men like Ed Kemper and David Berkowitz.
It's been quite the ride.
We saw how those prison conversations were forged into forensic tools, differentiating MO from signature that ultimately broke Wayne Williams on the witness stand in Atlanta and tracked Robert Hansen through the frozen woods of Alaska.
And stepping back from the gruesome details, the ultimate value of the behavioral science unit isn't just about catching killers after the bodies have been found. The true legacy of this work is establishing a comprehensive taxonomy of human evil, decoding the warning signs of the homicidal triad, so that society might one day evolve from reacting to serial killers to actively preventing them from forming in the first place. Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative and haunting thought from the case files. At one point in his career, the FBI investigator was sent a photograph by a local police department in Colorado. The photo had been developed at a local lab, and the technician was disturbed by it.
Understandably so.
It showed a man in his late 20s, dressed in full camouflage gear, posing proudly on the tailgate of his 4x4 truck. In one hand, he held a high-powered hunting rifle. In the other hand, he held a child's Barbie doll. But he hadn't just held it, he had meticulously mutilated, bound, and tortured the plastic doll, stringing it up like a kill.
The local police were paralyzed. No law had been broken. You cannot arrest a man for defacing his own plastic doll.
Yeah.
But the profilers looked at that photograph, and a chill went down their spines.
Yeah.
They knew, based on the behavioral escalation they had studied in the prisons, that they were looking at dangerousness waiting to happen. They knew that eventually the fantasy would outgrow the toy. The plastic would no longer satisfy the urge for domination. He needed to feel the fear of living flesh.
So I leave you with this question to mull over. If we now possess the psychological tools and the behavioral science to accurately spot a serial killer in the making, how do we balance the liberties of a free society with the moral obligation to stop a monster before they strike? If you see the lion staring at the herd, do you wait for it to kill the antelope, or do you take the shot? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the darkest corners of the human mind. Keep questioning the ordinary things you see every day.